Story 1.
The footsteps above my ceiling. Even now, I still check the attic access panel twice before I go to sleep. I know that sounds irrational. I know most people would probably laugh at it. But there are certain habits your body keeps after fear settles into you deeply enough. And this is one of mine. Every apartment I have lived in since that house, I have checked the ceiling before bed. Sometimes more than once. Sometimes in the middle of the night after waking from a dream I cannot fully remember. Because once you hear footsteps above your ceiling when nobody else is supposed to be there, your brain never really lets it go. This happened about 4 years ago, not long after my breakup with Melissa. We had been together almost 6 years, and when things ended, it happened in the quietest way possible. No screaming, no dramatic fight. She just sat across from me one night and admitted neither of us seemed happy anymore. 2 weeks later, she moved out, and suddenly every room I walked into felt unfamiliar. I found the rental house a month later. It sat at the end of a narrow street lined with old trees that leaned over the road like they were trying to block out the sky. The place itself was small and older than anything I had rented before. But it was cheap, clean, and far enough from the city that nights felt genuinely quiet again. After the breakup, quiet sounded comforting. The landlord told me the house had been built sometime in the late 70s. The carpet had been replaced recently, but the kitchen cabinets were original, and the attic insulation still smelled faintly dusty whenever the weather got hot. I remember liking that detail at the time. The house felt lived in, safe in a strange way. The first week there it actually felt peaceful. I unpacked slowly, ordered takeout most nights, and spent hours sitting on the back porch listening to insects in the woods behind the property. For the first time in months, I started sleeping through the night again. Then little things started happening. At first, they were easy to dismiss. I would walk into the kitchen in the morning and find the cabinet door open, even though I was sure I had closed it the night before. One afternoon, I noticed my television remote sitting on the bathroom counter. Another morning, the carton of milk was already out on the counter before I made coffee. I blamed exhaustion for all of it. After the breakup, my sleep schedule had been terrible for months. I figured stress was making me absent-minded. That explanation made enough sense that I stopped thinking about it almost immediately, until the footsteps started. The first time I heard them, I was lying in bed around 2:30 in the morning. I remember checking my phone because the sound woke me slowly instead of all at once. It sounded faint and uneven, somewhere above me. Step, step, a long pause. Then another slow movement overhead. At first, I honestly thought it was an animal. The house backed against trees, and older homes always make strange noises at night anyway. I convinced myself it was probably a raccoon moving around near the roof. The sound stopped after maybe 30 seconds. The next night, it happened again. This time, the footsteps lasted longer. They moved from one side of the ceiling to the other with slow, careful pacing that made me picture someone walking quietly through a dark room, trying not to wake another person nearby. That thought unsettled me enough that I turned on my bedroom lamp. The footsteps stopped immediately. I stayed awake another hour listening for movement, but the house went completely silent again. Over the next few nights, the sounds became consistent, always between 2 and 3 in the morning, always above the ceiling, always slow. I started noticing patterns in the movement. Whatever was up there would pause for long stretches, then continue again with deliberate pacing. Sometimes the footsteps crossed directly over my bedroom. Other nights, they stayed farther down the hallway. One night, I actually laughed at myself for getting nervous. I remember sitting in bed thinking about how ridiculous I sounded. A grown man scaring himself over old house noises. I almost texted my friend Daniel about it, but I stopped because I could already imagine his reaction. He would joke about ghosts or raccoons or tell me stress was frying my brain. Part of me worried he might be right. But the sounds kept happening, and slowly, the atmosphere inside the house began changing. I stopped falling asleep easily. Every night, I found myself listening carefully after turning off the lights, waiting for 2 o'clock to arrive. I began keeping the television on longer because silence started making me uncomfortable. Small things around the house kept feeling wrong, too. Food disappeared faster than it should have. Bread vanished unusually quickly. Leftovers seemed smaller than I remembered. Once I found a soda can in the trash that I did not remember drinking. Again, I rationalized all of it. I was distracted, tired, depressed. That explanation remained easier than admitting something else might be happening. Then came the night with the hallway dust. I got home late from work after helping close inventory at the warehouse. It was almost midnight, and I remember feeling exhausted enough that my eyes burned. I tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter, walked toward the bedroom, and stopped halfway down the hallway. There was pale insulation dust scattered across the floor beneath the attic hatch. Not a lot, just enough to notice. For a second, I simply stared at it without understanding why it bothered me so much. Then I looked up. The attic panel was slightly open, only by an inch or two, but I knew immediately it had not looked like that before. I had never even touched it since moving in. I stood there for a long time, completely still, trying to think logically. I told myself the wood had shifted from temperature changes. Maybe the latch had loosened naturally. Older houses settle all the time. But none of those explanations stopped the feeling creeping slowly into my stomach. I did not open the hatch that night. Instead, I cleaned the dust with paper towels and locked myself inside my bedroom. I barely slept. Every tiny sound in the house kept snapping me awake. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the footsteps again directly above me. Slow, measured, heavy enough this time that the ceiling creaked softly beneath them. The next evening, after spending the entire workday thinking about it, I finally decided I needed to check the attic. I borrowed a ladder from the maintenance room behind the warehouse and brought it home in my truck. Even carrying it inside made me feel stupid. I kept telling myself I was about to discover a raccoon nest and laugh about the entire thing later. But my hands still shook while setting the ladder beneath the hatch. The hallway felt unusually cold that night. I remember that clearly. I climbed slowly, one step at a time, until my head reached the opening. The attic smelled thick with dust and old wood. My flashlight barely reached beyond the insulation and support beams stretching into darkness. At first, everything looked empty. Then I heard movement deeper inside the attic. Not scratching, not scurrying. A slow shift of weight, like someone carefully repositioning themselves in the dark. I froze halfway out of the attic opening with one hand still gripping the ladder beneath me. Every instinct told me to climb down quietly and leave the house immediately, but fear does strange things to your judgment. Instead of moving, I kept listening. The attic became silent again after that single movement, so quiet that I could hear my own breathing echoing off the rafters. I remember sweeping the flashlight farther into the darkness, expecting to catch the reflection of animal eyes somewhere between the beams. Instead, the light landed on something that looked almost like a sleeping area pressed against the far wall. A blanket, maybe a pillow. Then the darkness shifted again before I could fully focus on it. And then I realized I was not alone up there. Story 2. The man behind the laundry room while I moved into the basement apartment because it was the only place I could afford after losing my job downtown. The building sat behind a row of closed storefronts near the edge of the city, half hidden by overgrown hedges and broken fencing. Even during the daytime, the property felt strangely dim. The hallway smelled faintly like wet concrete and old cigarettes, and the fluorescent lights overhead buzzed constantly like trapped insects. The landlord called the apartment quiet and private. That should have been my first warning. The unit itself was small but manageable. One bedroom, a narrow bathroom, a tiny kitchen, and a laundry room connected directly to the back wall of the apartment. The ceilings were low enough that I could almost touch them without stretching. At first, I actually liked how enclosed the place felt. After sleeping on friends' couches for nearly 2 months, having a space entirely to myself felt comforting. The first night there, I noticed how clearly sound traveled through the walls. I could hear footsteps from apartments above me with strange detail, almost as if the people upstairs were walking directly across my ceiling. Pipes rattled constantly somewhere behind the walls, and every now and then I heard coughing nearby. Not loud coughing, just soft, dry coughs that seemed strangely close. At around 3 in the morning, I woke up because I heard someone moving furniture nearby. There was a dragging sound against concrete, followed by slow footstep and another cough. The noise lasted almost 20 minutes. The next afternoon, while checking my mailbox, I casually mentioned the noise to an older woman from upstairs. She frowned immediately when I brought up the apartment beside mine. "That unit's empty," she said. I remember laughing awkwardly because I thought she misunderstood me. "No," I told her. "I mean the one connected to my bedroom wall." She shook her head slowly. "Nobody's rented that place in months." I tried not to let that bother me. Old buildings make noise. Pipes echo strangely. Maybe the sounds traveled down from another floor. That explanation made enough sense that I accepted it for a while. But after that conversation, I started paying closer attention. Almost every night I heard movement somewhere beyond the walls. Slow footsteps. Coughing. Once, what sounded like a muffled sneeze directly behind the bedroom. And every single time I checked outside afterward, the hallway remained completely empty. A week later, smaller things inside the apartment started feeling wrong too. I would leave a kitchen light on before taking a shower and come back to find it switched off. Towels I hung neatly beside the bathroom sink looked slightly disturbed later, like someone had wiped wet hands on them. Food containers in the refrigerator sometimes sat half open when I knew I had sealed them. The strangest thing involved the chair near the kitchen table. It kept turning. Not dramatically, just slightly. I would leave it facing inward toward the table before work, then come home and find it angled toward the hallway leading to the laundry room. At first, I honestly questioned myself. Maybe I was absent-minded. Maybe I was moving things without remembering because stress kept distracting me. Losing my job had wrecked my sleep schedule, and basement apartments already make people feel isolated after enough time underground. Still, the feeling inside the apartment slowly changed. The place stopped feeling private. That's the best way I can explain it. Sometimes while eating dinner or watching television, I would suddenly become aware of the silence around me in a way that made my skin tighten. It felt less like being alone and more like being unobserved temporarily. One evening, I noticed the laundry room smelled unusually damp. I went inside expecting a leak and started moving old cardboard boxes stacked against the far wall. Behind them, I found a narrow metal door about 4 feet tall with chipped white paint and a rusted handle. I had not noticed it before. The door blended almost perfectly into the wall itself. Curious, I tried opening it, but it barely moved before stopping hard against something inside. The next morning, I mentioned it to the landlord while he was fixing a broken light near the entrance. "Oh, that thing," he said casually. "Old plumbing access. Doesn't lead anywhere useful." "Why is it blocked?" He shrugged. "Probably debris behind it." "Building's old." Then he changed the subject almost immediately. For some reason, his reaction unsettled me more than the door itself. That night, the noises inside the walls became impossible to ignore. Around 2 in the morning, I woke suddenly because it sounded like somebody was breathing nearby. Not snoring. Breathing. Slow and uneven. At first, I thought the sound came from outside my bedroom window, but after sitting upright in silence, I realized it was coming from the wall beside my bed. I remember staring at the drywall for nearly a full minute without moving. The breathing stopped. Then, very softly, I heard a knock. 3 gentle taps from inside the wall. I did not sleep again that night. After that, paranoia settled into my routine completely. Every time I left for work, I started checking the apartment carefully before locking the door. I memorized the exact positions of objects around the kitchen. I began taking pictures with my phone before leaving so I could compare things later. And somehow, tiny details still kept changing. A cereal box shifted slightly closer to the counter edge. A bathroom cabinet left cracked open. My bedsheets wrinkled differently than I remembered. None of it was enough to prove anything. That uncertainty became the worst part. If something obvious had happened, I could have called the police or confronted the landlord directly. Instead, I spent weeks trapped between logic and instinct, constantly trying to convince myself I was imagining everything. Eventually, I started setting traps. Nothing dramatic. Just simple tests. I sprinkled flour across the laundry room floor near the hidden door before leaving for work. I placed a thin strip of clear tape along the frame where the door opened. Once I wedged the kitchen chair tightly beneath the handle before going out. Every time I returned home, something looked slightly disturbed. The flour appeared smudged near the edges. The tape hung loose from one corner. The chair sat inches away from where I had jammed it, but never enough for certainty. I stopped inviting people over because I knew how insane it sounded trying to explain any of this out loud. Even I barely believed myself half the time. Then the storm happened. The weather had been awful all day. Heavy rain hammered the basement windows so hard it sounded like handfuls of gravel hitting glass. Around 11 that night, the power suddenly went out across the entire building. Everything went silent immediately except for the rain. No fluorescent buzzing. No television noise. No humming appliances. Just darkness and water pounding outside. I grabbed my phone for light and walked carefully toward the kitchen to find candles. Halfway down the hallway, I noticed something that made my stomach drop instantly. The laundry room door stood open. I knew I had closed it earlier. The darkness inside looked thicker somehow, without electricity. My phone flashlight barely reached the back wall. For several seconds, I simply stood there staring at the small maintenance door. It was open too, only a few inches. But enough, I remember feeling completely frozen in place. Every rational thought in my head told me to leave the apartment immediately, but fear mixed strangely with curiosity at that moment. I needed to know what was behind that wall. Slowly, I walked closer. The smell hit me first. Stale air mixed with sweat and damp fabric. When I pulled the maintenance door wider, my flashlight revealed a narrow passage hidden behind the wall itself. Pipes stretched along the ceiling above layers of packed insulation, and the space looked just large enough for someone to crawl through on their hands and knees. Then I heard movement deeper inside. Fast movement. Something scraping quickly against concrete farther down the passage, retreating away from me. I backed up immediately and nearly dropped my phone. For one horrible second, I honestly thought someone might come crawling out of the darkness toward me. But the passage went silent again. I should have left right then. Instead, I crouched lower and pointed the flashlight deeper inside. About 10 feet into the passage, I saw blankets piled against the wall. Beside them sat empty water bottles, crushed food wrappers, and several cans stacked carefully in the corner. Someone had been living inside the walls around my apartment for weeks, maybe longer. But the part that still bothers me most is this. The blankets were still warm. I stumbled backward out of the laundry room and locked myself inside the bathroom with my phone in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. I remember trying to explain everything to the police dispatcher while whispering because I was terrified the person inside the walls could still hear me breathing through the vents. Officers arrived maybe 15 minutes later, though it felt much longer. They searched the maintenance passage carefully with flashlights and eventually discovered it connected to several unused spaces behind the basement units. Whoever had been hiding there already disappeared before they arrived. The officers questioned the landlord for nearly an hour afterward, and I overheard one of them asking whether former tenants still had access to the building. I moved out 3 days later without finishing my lease. For weeks afterward, I kept waking up convinced I could hear coughing inside my bedroom walls again. Even now, basement apartments make me uneasy. Sometimes I still think about those blankets hidden behind the drywall and wonder how many nights somebody sat silently on the other side of my bedroom, listening to me fall asleep. What frightens me most is knowing I never heard that person enter or leave the building. As far as I know, they could be living somewhere inside those walls today. Story 3. I wasn't the only one using my house key. The house looked safest in the afternoon. That is the part I still think about most. In daylight, nothing about it seemed threatening. It sat in a quiet suburb where people left sprinklers running too long and waved from driveways while pretending not to study their neighbors. There was a maple tree in the front yard, a cracked stone path to the porch, and pale yellow siding that made the whole place look warmer than it actually was. I inherited it from my great-aunt Elaine. She had lived there for almost 30 years before she died. We were not extremely close, but I visited her enough as a kid to remember the smell of lemon cleaner in the kitchen and the way she kept hard candies in a glass dish by the television. When the Lauer called to say she had left the house to me, I thought he had made a mistake. At the time, it felt like luck. I was renting a noisy apartment, working overtime, and saving almost nothing. The house needed repairs, but it was mine. For the first few weeks, I threw myself into renovating it. I painted walls after work, pulled up old carpet, replaced cabinet handles, and slept on a mattress in the upstairs bedroom surrounded by tools and cardboard boxes. It felt strange living inside someone else's life, but not frightening. Not at first. The first thing I noticed was the back door. I woke one morning and found it unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before bed. I had a habit of checking doors, especially in a new place. Still, I told myself I must have been tired. Renovating after 10-hour shifts will do that to a person. You lose track of simple things. 2 mornings later, it happened again. This time, it was the side door near the kitchen. The deadbolt was turned halfway, not fully open, just loose enough that the door moved when I touched it. I stood there with my coffee in one hand, staring at it longer than necessary. Then I locked it and went to work. After that, little things began changing around the house. A light would be on in a room I knew I had not entered. The television would be set to a channel I never watched. One morning, the shower curtain was slightly damp, even though I had not showered since the previous afternoon. Another time, I walked into the hallway and smelled cigarette smoke for maybe 3 seconds before it vanished. No one in my family smoked. Great Aunt Elaine hated cigarettes. I mentioned it to my friend Mark while he helped me carry old furniture to the curb. He laughed and said old houses held smells. Then he got quieter and added that maybe the place only felt strange because someone had died there. I did not like that explanation either. For a while, I chose the easiest answer. Stress, grief, exhaustion. Even if Elaine and I had not been very close, her presence remained everywhere. Her handwriting on labels in the pantry. Her curtains. Her old phone book still sitting near the landline jack. Sometimes I would turn a corner and expect to see her standing there in a cardigan, asking whether I wanted tea. So when things felt off, I blamed the house's history. Then came the curtain. It happened on a Thursday evening. I had forgotten my wallet at home and came back earlier than usual, just before sunset. As I pulled into the driveway, I glanced up at the second floor and saw movement behind the bedroom curtain. Not the curtain shifting from air. A person. A dark shape moved quickly away from the window. I sat in the car with both hands still on the steering wheel, staring up at the glass. My first thought was not ghost or memory or stress. It was burglar. I backed out of the driveway, parked down the street, and called the police. 2 officers arrived within 10 minutes. They searched the house room by room while I stood outside feeling embarrassed and terrified at the same time. Nothing was missing. No windows were broken. No doors were damaged. They checked closets, the basement, the attic, even behind the shower curtain. No one was inside. One officer suggested I might have seen a reflection from a passing car. I nodded because arguing would have sounded ridiculous. But I knew what I saw. After that night, the house changed completely. Or maybe I did. Every sound became important. Pipes expanding in the walls, branches tapping the siding, the refrigerator clicking on downstairs, the wind pressing against windows. I began sleeping with the hallway light on and my bedroom door locked. Then I started pushing a dresser against it before bed. It sounds dramatic now, but fear becomes practical when you are alone. I stopped listening to music while working on the house because I wanted to hear everything. I stopped wearing headphones. I kept a hammer within reach in every room, pretending they were just tools I had forgotten to put away. Still, nothing obvious happened. That was what made it worse. There was never a broken window. Never muddy footprints across the floor. Never missing jewelry or stolen electronics. Whoever or whatever was disturbing the house seemed uninterested in taking anything. Things only moved. A mug changed shelves. A chair shifted closer to the living room window. The basement light stayed on after I was certain I had turned it off. Once, I found the refrigerator open just enough for the interior light to glow across the kitchen floor in the middle of the night. That sight bothered me more than it should have. It looked intentional, like someone had opened it and walked away. I changed the locks that weekend. The locksmith was friendly and quick. He replaced the front, back, and side door locks in under an hour. For the first time in weeks, I felt embarrassed by how frightened I had been. I remember standing in the doorway after you left, holding the new keys, thinking that whatever had been happening was over. That night, I slept almost normally. The next morning, the living room lamp was on. I had unplugged it the day before while painting the wall behind it. Now it was plugged in again. I stood across the room staring at it until the soft yellow bulb began to hurt my eyes. That was the moment I understood something in a different way. If no one was breaking in, and if the locks were new, then either I was doing these things without remembering, or someone had access I did not understand. Neither possibility made me feel sane. I bought a small indoor camera after work. Nothing fancy. Just one of those motion activated devices people use to watch pets. I placed it on a bookshelf in the living room, hidden between stacked paint supplies and an old framed photo of Elaine. From that angle, it could see the front door, part of the staircase, and the hallway leading toward the kitchen. For 3 nights, nothing happened. The camera caught me coming home, carrying groceries, sanding the stair railing, walking through rooms half asleep. Watching myself on video made the house feel even lonelier somehow. On the 4th night, I stayed late at work to finish inventory. Around 1:17 in the morning, my phone buzzed. Motion detected. I expected to see myself from earlier, or maybe headlights through the window. Instead, the video showed the front door opening. A man stepped inside. He was not rushing. He was not hiding. He entered with the casual confidence of someone coming home after a long day. He wore dark pants, a gray jacket, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. In his right hand was a key. I watched the footage frozen at my desk, unable to breathe properly. He closed the door behind him and locked it. Then he removed his shoes. That detail nearly made me sick. A burglar does not usually take off his shoes. He placed them neatly by the door, walked into the living room, and stood there in the dark for almost a full minute. He did not look around nervously. He did not search drawers. He simply stood with his hands at his sides facing the staircase. Then he walked into the kitchen. The camera lost him for a while. When he came back, he was eating something from my refrigerator. Not quickly, calmly. He sat in my chair and ate in near darkness, as if he had done it many times before. At one point, he turned his head slightly toward the bookshelf, toward the camera. I paused the video and leaned closer to my phone. His face was mostly hidden, but I could see enough to know he was looking directly at it. Not accidentally, directly. I called the police from the parking lot and started driving home before the dispatcher even finished asking questions. I should not have done that. I know that now. But panic does not leave much room for good judgment. 2 officers met me outside the house. The front door was locked. They entered first with guns drawn and searched every room. Again, there was no one inside. But this time, the signs were there. The refrigerator door was not fully closed. A glass sat in the sink. The living room chair had been moved. And by the front door, on the mat, there was a small wet footprint where someone had stepped without shoes. The officers watched the footage twice. Neither said much. One asked whether Elaine had ever rented rooms to anyone. I told him no, not that I knew of. Another asked if any former caretakers, contractors, neighbors, or family members might have had keys. I thought about all the people who had passed through that house over 30 years. Plumbers, painters, delivery workers, distant relatives, friends of Elaine I had never met. The list suddenly felt endless. The police took the video and told me they would follow up, but their tone made it clear this might not become anything. Without a clear face, without a name, without knowing how many keys existed before I changed the locks, there was only so much they could do. I moved out 2 weeks later. People asked why I did not stay after installing better locks and cameras. The answer is simple. Once a place stops feeling like yours, there is no fixing it. Every room becomes a question. Every night becomes a waiting game. Before leaving, I watched the footage more times than I should have. There was one part one kept returning to. The man stood near the stairs, motionless, head tilted slightly upward. At first, I thought he was listening for me. But after watching it again, I realized he was staring toward the upstairs bedroom. The room where I slept. Months passed after I moved into a new apartment. The police never identified him. The case faded into silence. I tried to convince myself he had been some strange former tenant. Someone with an old copied key who knew Elaine's habits and kept using the house after she died. Then, one afternoon, I found an envelope in my mailbox. No return address, no stamp. Just my name written across the front. Inside was a single house key, not one of the new ones. An old brass key, worn smooth around the edges. There was no note, no explanation, just the key. I turned it over in my palm for a long time before I realized my hands were shaking. Then I understood the worst part. Whoever sent it knew where I live now.